The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows over the quiet suburban streets of Maple Ridge. It was one of those neighborhoods where every lawn looked like it had been trimmed with a ruler, and mailboxes stood perfectly aligned along the curb. People here took pride in their homes, their rules, and their sense of order. But beneath the surface, there were cracks, small ones that most people chose to ignore. 16-year-old Maya pulled her dad's old car into an empty driveway, letting out a frustrated sigh as she glanced at her phone again. Her GPS app had led her astray, and now she was hopelessly lost. She didn't recognize any of the street names or houses around her. All she wanted was to find her way back to her friends who were waiting for her at the mall. Maya drummed her fingers on the steering wheel, trying to figure out what to do next. She decided to park for a moment to check the map again. As far as she knew, the house in front of her seemed unoccupied. The windows were dark, and weeds sprouted through the cracks in the driveway. No harm in stopping here for just a minute, right? But not everyone saw it that way. Across the street, Mrs. Peterson peeked through her curtains, frowning at the unfamiliar car. To her, it stuck out like a sore thumb. Who would park in front of an empty lot? And why did the driver look so unsure? In her mind, these questions quickly turned into suspicion. Without thinking twice, she picked up her phone and dialed the non-emergency line for the police department. "Hi, yes, I'm calling about a suspicious vehicle," Mrs. Peterson said, her voice tight with concern. "It's parked in front of the old Thompson place. There's someone inside and they don't seem to belong here." On the other end of the line, Officer Darren Griggs listened intently. He'd patrolled this area for years and prided himself on keeping it safe. But lately, he'd noticed more complaints about strangers coming into the neighborhood. Most of them involved young people, kids hanging out late, skateboarding in cul-de-sacs, or blasting music from their cars. And while some might call him overly cautious, Darren believed you couldn't be too careful when it came to protecting property values. He grabbed his hat and headed out, pulling up behind Maya's car within minutes. Through the rearview mirror, Maya spotted the flashing lights and froze. Why was a cop here? She hadn't done anything wrong. Still, her heart began to race as she watched the officer step out of his cruiser. His hand rested casually on his holster, but the gesture made her stomach churn. Darren approached the car slowly, his eyes scanning the scene. The vehicle wasn't fancy. It looked older, maybe even beat up, but something about it set off alarms in his head. When he reached the driver's side window, he rapped sharply on the glass. "Hey!" "You," he barked. "What are you doing here?" Startled, Maya rolled down the window. I got lost," she stammered, holding up her phone. "I was just checking my map." "Lost?" Darren repeated, his tone dripping with skepticism. "This is private property. Do you live around here?" "No, sir," Maya replied quickly, trying to sound calm despite the lump forming in her throat. "I didn't mean to bother anyone. I'll leave right now." But Darren wasn't satisfied. Something about her explanation felt off to him. Maybe it was the way she spoke, the slight tremble in her voice, or the fact that she didn't immediately comply with his commands. Whatever it was, it made him uneasy. "Turn off the engine and step out of the car," he ordered, his hand moving closer to his gun. Maya blinked, panic rising in her chest. "Why? I told you I'm leaving. I said get out of the car." Darren snapped, louder this time. She hesitated, gripping the wheel tighter. Everything inside her screamed to stay put, to reason with him, to explain that she hadn't done anything wrong. But then she remembered all the stories she'd heard, all the videos she'd seen online. Stories of kids just like her being treated unfairly because of the color of their skin. Suddenly, fear overwhelmed logic. Her hands moved instinctively toward the keys, hoping to start the car and drive away. But before she could turn the ignition, Darren lunged forward, reaching through the open window. Their hands collided as they both grabbed for the keys. The struggle lasted only seconds, but it felt like an eternity, and then a loud crack shattered the silence. Time seemed to stop. Maya gasped, clutching her side as pain shot through her body. Blood seeped through her shirt, warm and sticky against her fingers. She slumped back into the seat, Unable to process what had just happened, Officer Darren Griggs stood frozen, his gun still raised, smoke curling from the barrel. For a split second, doubt flickered across his face. What had he done? But then his training kicked in and he radioed for backup, his voice steady but strained. Shots fired. Suspect down, requesting medical assistance? Neighbors began to emerge from their homes, drawn by the commotion. Some whispered nervously behind closed doors, while others gathered cautiously near the scene. None of them could believe what they were witnessing. A teenage girl, bleeding in the driveway of an empty house, surrounded by police cars and flashing lights. No one knew her name yet. No one realized who she really was. But deep down, many couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly, tragically wrong. The ambulance arrived within minutes, its siren wailing as it screeched to a halt in front of the empty house. Paramedics rushed to Maya's side, their faces grim as they assessed her condition. She was still conscious, but barely her breathing. Shallow, her skin pale. One of them shouted orders while another pressed down hard on her wound. Trying to stop the bleeding, Officer Griggs stood nearby, his hands trembling slightly as he holstered his gun. He watched the chaos unfold, his mind racing. What had just happened? Had he overreacted? No, he told himself firmly. He'd followed protocol. The girl hadn't listened. She'd resisted. That's what he would tell the investigators when they came. That's what he needed everyone else to believe, but the truth gnawed at him. Deep down, he knew something didn't feel right. The way she'd looked at him, not angry, not defiant, but scared. Terrified even, like she hadn't understood why this was happening to her. And now, seeing her lying there, so young and fragile, guilt began to creep in. But guilt wouldn't save him, not here. Not in a world where admitting fault could cost him everything. As the paramedics loaded Maya into the ambulance, neighbors whispered among themselves. Some were horrified, others confused. A few muttered about how these things always seem to happen in quiet neighborhoods like theirs. One woman shook her head and said, "It's sad, but you can't be too careful these days." Another man nodded in agreement, though neither of them could explain exactly what they meant by careful. Back at the police station, the gears of bureaucracy began to turn. By the time the press caught wind of the shooting, an official statement had already been prepared. It painted Officer Griggs as a hero who had acted in self-defense against a suspicious individual trespassing on private property. According to the report, the suspect, a minor female, had refused commands and attempted to flee, forcing the officer to use lethal force. No one mentioned that the suspect was a teenage girl who had simply gotten lost. No one talked about the fact that she had been unarmed, unthreatening, and alone. Instead, the narrative focused on protecting the officer and maintaining public order. After all, the last thing the department needed was another scandal splashed. Across the headlines, Griggs was placed on administrative leave pending an internal investigation. To outsiders, this might have seemed like accountability. But those within the system knew better. Administrative leave meant nothing. It was a temporary shield, a way to buy time until the storm passed. Meanwhile, higher-ups worked behind closed doors to control the damage. At the hospital, doctors fought to stabilize Maya. Her injuries were severe, but not fatal, at least not yet. She drifted in and out of consciousness, her body fighting to heal while her mind struggled to make sense of what had happened. Nurses hovered around her bed, monitoring her vitals and whispering prayers under their breath. They didn't know much about her beyond her age and the circumstances of her arrival, but they felt a deep sadness for the young girl whose life had been shattered in an instant. When word finally reached the mayor's office, it came through a phone call late that evening. Elijah Collins, the city's first black mayor, sat at his desk reviewing papers when his assistant stepped into the room. His face was pale, his expression grave. "Sir," the assistant said quietly, "you need to take this call. It's urgent." Elijah frowned, picking up the receiver. On the other end, a voice delivered the news. His daughter had been shot by a police officer. She was alive but barely and currently undergoing surgery. For a moment, Elijah couldn't breathe. The words hit him like a punch to the gut, leaving him dizzy and disoriented. His little girl, his bright, beautiful daughter. How could this happen? Why hadn't anyone called him sooner? He grabbed his coat and bolted out of the office, ignoring the questions from his staff as he raced to the hospital. The drive felt endless, each red light stretching into eternity. Memories flooded his mind. Maya as a toddler giggling on the playground, Maya practicing piano with determination etched on her face, Maya standing proudly beside him during his inauguration. She was his pride and joy, his reason for pushing forward despite the countless obstacles he'd faced as a black man in politics. When he finally arrived at the hospital, Elijah was met with chaos. Reporters had already gathered outside, cameras flashing as they shouted questions at anyone who walked through the doors. Inside, hospital staff guided him to a private waiting room where doctors gave him updates on Maya's condition. Every word they spoke felt like a knife twisting in his chest. "She's strong," one doctor assured him gently. "She has a good chance of pulling through." But Elijah couldn't shake the image of his daughter lying motionless in a hospital bed, tubes and wires attached to her frail body. Who would do such a thing, and why? As the hours dragged on, Elijah found himself grappling with emotions he hadn't felt in years: anger, fear, helplessness. As a politician, he'd always believed in working within the system to create change. He'd preached patience, compromise, and diplomacy. But now, sitting in that sterile waiting room, he wondered if he'd been fooling himself all along. Could the system ever truly protect people like Maya? Or was it designed to fail them? By morning, the story had exploded. News outlets carried headlines about the tragic incident in Maple Ridge, though details remained scarce. The police department doubled down on its initial statement, refusing to release the officer's name or provide further information. Protesters began gathering outside City Hall, demanding transparency and justice. Social media buzzed with outrage, hashtags trending nationwide. And yet, no one knew the full truth. No one except Elijah, and the weight of that knowledge crushed him. He thought about calling a press conference, about revealing Maya's identity, and exposing the injustice she had suffered, but he hesitated. Revealing her connection to him could shift the focus away from the real issue, the systemic racism and unchecked power that allowed such tragedies to occur. Still, silence felt unbearable. How could he sit idly by while his daughter fought for her life? That night, Elijah sat beside Maya's hospital bed, holding her hand tightly. Her eyes fluttered open briefly, meeting his gaze before closing again. Tears streamed down his face as he whispered promises he wasn't sure he could keep. "I'm sorry," he murmured. "I should have done more. I will do more. This ends now." Outside, the protests grew louder. Voices echoed through the streets, chanting for change. For Maya, for every child who deserved to grow up without fear. Elijah vowed to honor their cries, not just as a father, but as a leader. Whatever it took, he would fight for justice, for his daughter, and for the countless others whose stories had gone untold. By the third day, the story had taken on a life of its own. It wasn't just local news anymore, it was national. Protesters filled the streets, holding signs that read, "Justice for her," and "Enough is enough." Social media feeds were flooded with posts about police brutality, systemic racism, and the need for accountability. People who had never met Maya felt connected to her pain because they saw echoes of their own fears in her story. But despite the growing outrage, the official narrative remained unchanged. The police department stood by its claim that the shooting was justified self-defense. Officer Griggs' name was still being withheld, and no one, not even the mayor, had access to the full details of the incident. For Elijah Collins, this lack of transparency felt like a slap in the face. His daughter was fighting for her life. Yet the people responsible refused to answer basic questions. Maya's condition had stabilized, but she was far from okay. She drifted in and out of consciousness, her body weak and fragile. When she woke up, she didn't speak much. Sometimes she stared blankly at the ceiling, tears streaming silently down her cheeks. Other times, she clung to her father's hand as if afraid he might disappear too. The doctors said it would take time for her to process what had happened. But Elijah knew some wounds ran deeper than flesh. This wasn't just about physical recovery, it was about trust shattered. Innocence lost. As the days passed, Elijah found himself torn between two roles, the grieving father desperate to protect his child and the public figure expected to remain calm and composed. He spent hours pacing the hospital corridors, replaying the events in his mind. What if he hadn't let her borrow the car? What if he'd insisted she take an Uber instead? These questions haunted him, gnawing at his soul until sleep became impossible. Meanwhile, tensions in the city continued to escalate. Community leaders called emergency meetings, demanding answers from the police chief and the mayor's office. Local activists organized marches, drawing thousands of people into the streets. Among them were teenagers like Maya Young, scared and angry. They carried megaphones, chanting slogans that resonated with raw emotion. "We are not criminals," one girl shouted, her voice breaking. "Why does the world treat us like we are?" Back at the hospital, reporters camped outside, hoping for a glimpse of the mayor or any scrap of information about the victim. But Elijah avoided them. He couldn't bring himself to face the cameras, not yet. Not when he still didn't know. The whole truth then, late one night. Everything changed. A video surfaced. It came from an unlikely source, a teenage boy named Alex, who lived across the street from where the shooting had occurred. Like many others, Alex had heard the commotion and peeked outside. Unlike most, however, he'd grabbed his phone and started recording. At first, he hadn't thought much of it. Just another day in suburbia, another encounter with the cops. But after seeing the headlines and hearing the conflicting stories, he realized his footage might hold the key to understanding what really happened. The video was grainy and shaky, filmed through a cracked window pane. It showed Maya standing beside her car, hands raised in surrender as Officer Griggs approached her aggressively. You could hear her voice trembling as she tried to explain herself. "I'm sorry," she said repeatedly. "I'll leave, I promise." And, Then came the moment that made hearts stop. In the video, Griggs reached for his gun almost immediately, shouting commands that left no room for negotiation. The struggle over the keys lasted only seconds before the shot rang out. Maya collapsed, clutching her side as blood began to pool beneath her. Alex uploaded the video to social media without thinking twice. Within hours, it went viral. News outlets picked it up, playing it on loop during primetime broadcasts. Viewers watched in horror as the brutal reality unfolded before their eyes. There was no resistance, no threat, just a scared teenager trying to explain herself while a grown man pulled the trigger. The impact was immediate and devastating. Public opinion shifted overnight. Calls for justice grew louder, more insistent. Protesters marched to the police station, chanting for Griggs' arrest. Lawyers offered to represent Maya pro bono, vowing to hold the department accountable. Even politicians who had previously stayed silent began speaking out, condemning the shooting as an act of unnecessary violence. For Elijah, the video confirmed what he'd feared all along. His daughter hadn't provoked anyone. She hadn't done anything wrong. She was simply a young black girl caught in the crosshairs of prejudice and fear. Watching the footage broke something inside him. He sat alone in his office, staring at the screen until his vision blurred with tears. How could this happen in a country that claimed to value freedom and equality? How could it happen to her? That evening, Elijah decided enough was enough. He called a press conference, determined to tell the world exactly who Maya was and why her story mattered. Standing behind a podium flanked by family photos, he introduced himself not as the mayor, but as a father. His voice shook as he spoke, each word heavy with emotion. "My daughter is alive today because of miracles and prayers," he began. "But she shouldn't have needed either. She is 16 years old. She was driving home from school when she got lost. That's it. No crime, no threat. Just a mistake anyone could make." He paused, swallowing hard. What happened to her isn't an isolated incident. It's part of a pattern of profiling, of bias, of lives destroyed because of the color of someone's skin. My family has worked hard to build bridges in this community. We've tried to lead by example. But tonight, I stand here as proof that no amount of success or privilege can shield you from injustice. The crowd listened in silence, some wiping away tears. Reporters scribbled furiously in their notebooks, capturing every word. When Elijah finished, applause erupted not just from those in the room, but from viewers watching live streams around the world. For the first time in days, people felt hope. Hope that maybe, just maybe, Maya's story could spark real change behind closed doors. However, the fight was far from over. Internal Affairs reopened the investigation, this time under intense scrutiny. Griggs' past came under the microscope. Complaints filed against him for racial profiling, aggressive behavior, and excessive force. None of these complaints had ever led to disciplinary action, but now they painted a troubling picture. Witnesses came forward, sharing stories of similar encounters with the officer. One woman described how he'd handcuffed her son for walking home late at night. Another recalled being stopped multiple times for routine checks, despite having committed no offense. Despite the mounting evidence, Griggs' supporters rallied around him. Fellow officers defended his actions, claiming he'd been following protocol. Conservative commentators argued that Maya should have complied immediately, ignoring the fact that compliance often didn't guarantee safety for black individuals. Meanwhile, Elijah received threats, racist messages warning him to back off or face consequences. Through it all, Maya remained at the center of the storm. Though she hadn't asked for this spotlight, her story had become a symbol of resilience and resistance. As she slowly regained strength, she began to understand the weight of what had happened to her. Friends visited her in the hospital, bringing cards and flowers. Strangers sent letters of support, thanking her for inspiring them to speak out. And though she still struggled to find words, she started imagining a future where her voice could make a difference. For Elijah, the battle ahead seemed daunting. But as he looked at his daughter lying in that hospital bed, determination replaced despair. He vowed to fight not just for her, but for every child who deserved to grow up free from fear. Because if Maya's story could teach the world anything, it was that silence wasn't an option. Change wouldn't come unless people demanded it. And demanded they did. The video of Maya's shooting had ignited a firestorm, but it didn't take long for the backlash to hit. Within days, Officer Griggs' defenders launched their counterattack. Conservative media outlets began framing the incident as an isolated mistake blown out of proportion by woke mobs and opportunistic politicians. Pundits argued that Griggs had been doing his job protecting property, enforcing laws, and that holding him accountable would only weaken law enforcement further. It's easy to play judge and jury on social media, one commentator said, during a heated debate on national television. But real policing is messy. You can't expect officers to second-guess themselves every time they respond to a call. Others took aim at Elijah Collins, accusing him of exploiting his daughter's tragedy for political gain. They claimed he was using his position as mayor to push a divisive agenda, ignoring the fact that this was his child lying in a hospital bed. Some even suggested Maya must have done something to provoke the officer, despite the clear evidence showing otherwise. For Elijah, these attacks felt like punches to the gut. He hadn't asked for any of this. All he wanted was justice, not just for Maya, but for everyone who had suffered because of unchecked power and prejudice. But now, the same systems he'd worked so hard to reform were turning against him. At City Hall, tensions boiled over. Council members whispered behind closed doors, urging Elijah to tone down his rhetoric. "You're polarizing the community," one warned him during a private meeting. "If you keep pushing this narrative, you'll alienate voters." Is that really what you want? Elijah clenched his fists beneath the table, forcing himself to stay calm. "This isn't about politics," he said through gritted teeth. "It's about accountability. If we don't address this now, it will happen again, and next time, someone might not survive." But the pressure mounted. Even within his own administration, voices urged caution. Allies who had once stood firmly by his side began to distance themselves, worried about the fallout from taking such a bold stance. Some suggested offering a settlement to avoid a lengthy legal battle. Others hinted that pursuing charges against Griggs could damage relationships with the police union, a powerful force in local elections. Meanwhile, Griggs' defense team went on the offensive. They painted Maya as reckless and defiant, arguing that her actions had forced the officer to act in self-defense. They pointed to minor inconsistencies in witness statements, trying to cast doubt on the video footage. In interviews, Griggs himself maintained his innocence, claiming he'd feared for his life when Maya reached for the car keys. "I did what I had to do," he told reporters outside his lawyer's office. "I followed my training. I protected myself and the neighborhood." His words sparked outrage online, but they also found traction among certain groups. Supporters rallied around him, raising funds for his legal defense and organizing counter-protests. Signs reading "Back the Blue" popped up across town, clashing with the calls for justice echoing through the streets. Amidst all this chaos, Maya struggled to find her footing. Physically, she was improving, her wounds healing slowly, though. Scars remained both visible and invisible. Emotionally, however, she felt lost. Friends tried to visit, bringing laughter and light into her hospital room, but the weight of what had happened lingered heavily. She couldn't stop thinking about the officer's face, the way he'd looked at her as if she were less than human, less than worthy. One afternoon, while scrolling through social media, Maya stumbled upon hateful comments directed at her family. Strangers questioned whether she deserved sympathy, calling her names and blaming her for the entire ordeal. Her hands shook as she stared at the screen, tears welling up in her eyes. How could people be so cruel? Didn't they understand how much pain she was already carrying? Her father noticed the change in her demeanor immediately. When he entered her room later that evening, he found her sitting silently by the window, staring out at the city lights. He sat beside her, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. "What's wrong, sweetheart?" he asked gently. She hesitated before handing him her phone. Elijah scanned the comments, his jaw tightening with each line. His heart broke for his daughter, for the added burden she now carried. But instead of shielding her from the ugliness, he chose honesty. "People are scared," he said finally. "Scared of change, scared of losing control. That's why they lash out? But don't let them win, okay? Your voice matters more than theirs." Maya nodded, though she wasn't sure she believed him yet. Still, his words planted a seed, a small flicker of hope that maybe, just maybe, she could turn her pain into purpose. As weeks turned into months, the case moved toward trial. Lawyers debated motions, filed appeals, and argued over evidence admissibility. Every step forward felt like 2 steps back. Meanwhile, protests continued, drawing larger crowds each time. Activists organized town halls, workshops, and marches, keeping the conversation alive. The movement inspired by Maya's story spread beyond Maple Ridge, reaching cities nationwide. In the midst of this whirlwind, Elijah made a decision that shocked many. He announced he wouldn't seek re-election. For years, he dreamed of serving another term, of continuing to build bridges and create opportunities for marginalized communities. But now, he realized his true calling lay elsewhere. He wanted to focus on grassroots efforts, on empowering young people like Maya to speak up and demand better. "I'm stepping down," he declared during a press conference. "Not because I've given up, but because I believe lasting change comes from the ground up. It's time for new voices to lead, to carry this torch forward." His announcement drew mixed reactions. Supporters praised his courage, hailing him as a visionary leader willing to sacrifice personal ambition for the greater good. Critics accused him of abandoning ship, using his daughter's tragedy as an excuse to dodge accountability. Either way, the decision cemented his legacy as a man unafraid to challenge the status quo. For Maya, watching her father step aside was bittersweet. On one hand, she admired his strength and conviction. On the other, she worried about what it meant for their future. Would stepping away make them safer or more vulnerable? Only time would tell. As the trial approached, anticipation built. Everyone knew this moment would define not just Maya's fate, but the broader fight for justice. Would Officer Griggs face consequences for his actions? Or would the system protect him, reinforcing the very patterns Elijah had vowed to dismantle? On the morning of opening arguments, Maya sat nervously in the courtroom, flanked by her family and lawyers. Cameras lined the walls, capturing every detail for the world to see. Across the aisle, Griggs sat stoically, his expression unreadable. As the prosecution presented its case, laying out the timeline and evidence piece by piece, Naya listened intently. Each word felt like a hammer striking nails into history's coffin, the old version of history, anyway. But when the defense took the stand, things grew complicated. Witnesses wavered under cross-examination. Technicalities muddied the waters. Doubts crept in, subtle but insidious. By the time closing arguments concluded, the outcome hung precariously in the balance. Days later, the verdict arrived, a hung jury. Unable to reach a unanimous decision, the jurors declared a mistrial. Gasps rippled through the courtroom as Griggs rose from his seat, free to walk away for now. Outside, protesters erupted in anger, chanting slogans and waving signs. Reporters swarmed Elijah, demanding his reaction. But he simply stood there, his arm around Maya, looking exhausted yet resolute. "This isn't over," he told the crowd. "We won't stop fighting until the system changes for good." And deep down, Maya believed him. Because even though the trial hadn't delivered the justice they sought, something else had emerged from the ashes, a movement, a generation, unwilling to stay silent, and a girl determined to rise above the pain, no matter how long it took. The mistrial verdict hit like a punch to the gut. For Maya, it wasn't just disappointment, it was devastation. She had hoped for justice, not perfection, but what she got instead was silence. The kind of silence that felt heavier than words, heavier even than the bullet wound in her side. As she sat in the car with her father driving them home from the courthouse, tears streamed down her face. She didn't bother wiping them away. "I don't understand," she whispered finally, her voice breaking. "How can they let him go? How can they act like this never happened?" Elijah gripped the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles white. He wanted to tell her everything would be okay, that they'd appeal, that somehow the system would right itself. But he couldn't lie. To her, not again. Not after everything she'd been through. "Sometimes," he said softly, choosing his words carefully, "the system doesn't work the way it's supposed to. It's built to protect some people more than others. That's why we have to keep pushing back, no matter how hard it gets." Maya turned toward the window, watching the city blur past. She didn't respond, but her silence spoke volumes. Inside, she wrestled with anger, sadness, and something worse, hopelessness. If the courts wouldn't give her justice, who would? Over the next few weeks, life settled into an uneasy rhythm. Maya returned to school, though nothing felt normal anymore. Friends tiptoed around her, unsure of what to say or how to act. Teachers offered sympathetic smiles but avoided discussing the incident altogether. Even walking down the hallway felt strange, like everyone was staring at her, whispering behind her back. Some days she considered skipping class entirely, retreating to the safety of her room where the world couldn't reach her, but then there were moments when she remembered her father's words, "Your voice matters more than theirs." Those words became a lifeline, pulling her out of the darkness whenever it threatened to swallow her whole. Slowly, tentatively, she began finding ways to use that voice. She started small at first, just talking to close friends about what had happened. Then she joined a local youth advocacy group, attending meetings held in community centers and church basements. At first, she listened more than she spoke, absorbing stories from other young people who had faced similar struggles. Hearing their experiences made her realize she wasn't alone. There were hundreds, thousands of kids like her, fighting battles no one should have to fight. One evening, during a meeting, the group leader asked if anyone wanted to share their story. Maya hesitated, her heart pounding as all eyes turned to her. She hadn't planned on speaking, but suddenly the words poured out, unbidden and raw. "I didn't think this could happen to me," she admitted, her voice trembling. "I thought being careful meant staying safe. I thought following the rules meant I'd be okay. But none of that mattered when the person deciding my fate saw me as less than human." The room fell silent as she spoke, her pain hanging heavy in the air. When she finished, several people approached her, thanking her for sharing. One girl hugged her tightly, saying, "You're so brave. Thank you for telling your truth." For the first time in months, Maya felt a flicker of hope. Maybe she couldn't change the outcome of her case, but she could still make a difference. Her story wasn't just hers anymore, it belonged to everyone who refused to stay silent. Meanwhile, Elijah threw himself into building a foundation focused on police accountability and youth empowerment. He partnered with activists, educators, and legal experts to create programs aimed at preventing future tragedies. Body cameras became mandatory for officers in Maple Ridge, thanks largely to public pressure spurred by Maya's case. Community oversight boards gained more authority, ensuring civilians had a say in how law enforcement operated, but Elijah knew these changes weren't enough. Real reform required deeper work, changing hearts and minds, challenging biases ingrained over generations. So he traveled across the country, speaking at schools, town halls, and conferences. He shared Maya's story not as a cautionary tale, but as a call to action. Every child deserves to grow up without fear, he often said during his speeches. Fear of walking home late at night. Fear of getting lost in the wrong neighborhood. Fear of encountering someone sworn to protect them but trained to see them as a threat. Until we address that fear, we haven't truly served our communities. His message resonated deeply, inspiring countless individuals to join the movement. Young people, in particular, embraced the cause with passion and urgency. They organized rallies, created art projects, and used social media to amplify marginalized voices. What had started as a single tragedy blossomed into a nationwide reckoning, one that forced society to confront uncomfortable truths about race, power, and privilege. As for Griggs, his freedom came at a cost. Though he avoided prison, he lost his job and faced ostracism from the community. Former colleagues distanced themselves, unwilling to associate with someone tainted by scandal. His name became synonymous with failure, a reminder of what happens when unchecked power collides with unchecked prejudice. Still, Maya refused to let bitterness consume her. Every time anger bubbled up inside her, she channeled it into something productive. She wrote essays, gave interviews, and participated in panel discussions. Her courage inspired others to speak out, creating a ripple effect that reached far beyond Maple Ridge. By spring, Maya stood on stage at a national youth summit, addressing thousands of attendees. Gone was the timid girl who once doubted her worth. In her place stood a confident young woman ready to demand better for herself, for her peers, and for generations to come. "When I was shot," she told the crowd, her voice steady and strong, "I thought my life was over. But now, I know it was just beginning." Because every day is a chance to rewrite the script, to challenge the systems that try to hold us down. Together we can build a world where no one has to live in fear. The audience erupted in applause, rising to their feet as Maya smiled. Real smile, full of hope and determination. For the first time in a long time, she felt free.